How far would you go for justice when the judge himself is the one who wronged you? What if the law, the very system designed to protect you, became your prison cell? This isn't some theoretical question. For years, this was the very air Tamar breathed, an air thick with the dust of broken promises, of widowhood, and of being left behind in her father's house. Her name, Tamar, means palm tree, which must have felt like a cruel joke from God, because her life was a barren, endless desert. She was the twice-marked widow, first by Ah, then by Onan. To the outside world, Judah's sons didn't die because of their own sins, but because of the curse she supposedly carried. She was the barren ground, the woman who brought an end to things. That lie, whispered in the corners of the market and declared in every averted gaze, was her daily sentence of public shaming that crushed her soul and silenced her faith. Her only hope was a single thread, a promise from her father-in-law, Judah, the powerful clan leader. Wait in your father's house until my son Shelah is grown. Shelah, the last son, her legal claim, her only shot at having a name and a place in the world. The law of levirate marriage was clear. It was her right, and she hung the last scraps of her trust on that promise, believing the order of men would reflect the justice of God. But the years dragged on, cruel and empty. Shelah grew up strong and ready, but the call from Judah never came. The promise rotted on the vine, turning into a convenient lie. Her father-in-law's silence wasn't forgetfulness. It was a decision. He had sentenced her to oblivion, terrified that her so-called curse would take the life of his last heir. Before we dive into the act of courage that would change everything, I'd love to feel our community connecting here. Drop the city you're tuning in from in the comments. Knowing this message is traveling and reaching so many hearts is what gives this work its meaning. It's a joy to read every single one. Now, get ready, because we're about to witness how faith, when pushed to the absolute limit, can forge an act of unimaginable audacity. You're about to see how God often chooses the most controversial paths and the most humiliated people to carry out his justice, teaching us that sometimes you have to challenge the honor of men to claim the honor that comes from heaven. Confirmation of the betrayal arrived on an ordinary day, carried on the dust of a passing caravan. Travella, oblivious to the weight of his words, shared the news. Judah is in Timnah for the sheep-shearing festival. Timnah, a party, family. Meanwhile she, the daughter-in-law who'd been denied a future, was wasting away in her prison of widowhood. The words didn't land like a drop of rain in her spirit. They hit like a stone, shattering the thin ice of hope she had left. In that moment, the truth became crystal clear and sharp as a razor. The promise hadn't just been forgotten. It had been deliberately dishonored. Judah, the guardian of the law, was celebrating his prosperity while actively stealing her right, her life. He had sacrificed her on the altar of his own superstition, making himself the judge, jury, and executioner of her future. The ache in her chest turned to fire, a fire that burned away the tears of self-pity and forged a new resolve. She stood up, no longer the passive victim of circumstance. God's silence would not be an excuse for her inaction. If heaven wasn't answering her whispers, maybe it was waiting for a shout, an action, an act that would force heaven and earth to look at her. In her quiet room, a different kind of prayer was born. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. "Oh God of Abraham, your law has been turned into a weapon against me. Will the heavenly lawgiver watch in silence while the judge on earth perverts justice? Then you be my judge." The palm tree, bent for so long, didn't break. It began to rise, and in her heart, a desperate, terrifying, and righteous plan started to take shape. A plan that would cover her in shame in the eyes of the world, so that she could finally find justice in the eyes of God. The first step of her rebellion was a quiet act, done in the solitude of her room. Tamar took off her widow's clothes. The rough, scratchy fabric that had been her second skin for years fell to the floor like an abandoned cocoon. Every fold of that cloth held the scent of grief, the weight of judgment, and the dust of a pointless Wait, in shedding it, she wasn't just changing her outfit, she was shedding the victim identity that had been forced upon her. She would no longer be the widow of Onan. From this moment on, she would be the architect of her own destiny. In its place, she dressed herself in a terrible and sacred purpose. She covered her face with a thick veil, one that erased her, made her anonymous. It was both armor and a mask. To the world, that veil would mark her as a prostitute, a woman on the side of the road. But in her heart, that veil was her judge's robe. She was cloaking herself in a calculated shame, a self-imposed humiliation. To expose the hidden shame of the man who was supposed to be a pillar of honor in Israel, it was a terrifying reversal. To be seen by God, she had to become invisible to men. The journey to the entrance of Enema, on the road to Timnah, was the longest of her life. Every step on that dusty path was a battle against the fear screaming in her mind. "Turn back," the panic hissed. "You'll be discovered, stoned to death. Your shame will be permanent." But another voice, deeper and steadier, pushed her forward. It was the voice of a divine promise that echoed beyond the betrayal of men. She wasn't walking toward a sin, but a showdown, a reckoning. Her palms were sweating, but her feet didn't falter. She sat by the roadside, a crossroads, a place between worlds. There, under the hot sun, she waited. Time crawled, every approaching caravan made her heart pound. Every stranger's glance felt like a needle prick. It was here, on the border between honor and disgrace, that her plan would be tested. She was a hunter waiting for her prey, but a hunter whose only power was her complete vulnerability. Silence was her shield, and waiting was her weapon. Then she saw him, the figure of Judah, her father-in-law, walking with the confidence of a man who owns the ground he walks on. He was laughing with his friends, completely oblivious to the veiled figure on the roadside. To him, the world was simple, ordered by his rules and his will. He didn't see Tamar, the daughter-in-law, he'd condemned to be forgotten. He just saw an opportunity, an anonymous distraction on his way to the festival. A chill ran down Tamar's spine, a mix of dread and a cold, hard resolve. The moment had come. He approached, and Tamar's world shrank to the small space between them. Judah's voice was casual, almost bored, as he made his proposition. "Let me come in." "To you," he said, never knowing he was speaking to the keeper of his family line. He didn't see the justice in her eyes, hidden behind the veil. He just saw a body. The sheer banality of his sin was the final insult to the depth of the pain he'd caused her. Tamar kept her voice steady, disguised, her heart a burning coal. "What will you give me to come into you?" she asked. The question wasn't about a price, it was about proof. He offered a young goat from the flock, a standard payment. But she didn't want a goat. She wanted his identity. "Give me a pledge until you send it," she insisted. And then she asked for the unthinkable. She asked for the keys to his patriarchal soul. "Your signet, your cord, and the staff in your hand." For a split second, time seemed to stop. The signet ring was his signature, his authority. The cord it hung on was part of his very identity. The staff was the symbol of his rule, of his leadership over the clan. To hand over those items was to hand over himself. But Judah, blinded by arrogance and a fleeting desire, didn't see the trap. He just saw a shrewd negotiation from a roadside prostitute. With a shrug, he gave her everything. The proof of his identity, the weapon of his undoing. When Tamar held those objects, their weight was immense. The cool clay of the signet, the braided cord, the smooth, worn wood of the staff. She wasn't holding a payment. She was holding justice in her hands. For one dizzying moment, Tipawerad shifted. The act was done in a silence, heavy with meaning that only she understood. He left her there with the promise to send payment and went on his way. The encounter already forgotten. But Tamar knew. The seed of justice and the seed of life had just been planted in the very same instant. If you've ever had to make a terrible choice for a cause you believed was right, maybe you understand the weight Tamar carried in that moment. It wasn't the weight of shame, but of responsibility. Drop Amen in the comments if you believe God has the power to use our most desperate acts to fulfill a greater purpose. Your faith strengthens us all. As soon as Judah's figure vanished over the horizon, Tamar got up. The dusty earth of the road seemed to cling to her, a filth she needed to wash away. She retraced her steps, but the woman walking back was not the same one who had left. The fear of the journey out was replaced by the gravity of the return. In the precarious safety of her father's house, she removed the veil of anonymous shame and put back on the familiar clothes of the widow. She returned to her cell. But Teastime, hidden in her robes, was the key that could either set her free or seal her doom. Days later, the village was buzzing with a curious story. Judah's friend, Hera, was going door looking for a shrine prostitute who had been at the entrance to an aim. He had a young goat with him, payment for his master's debt of honor. No one had seen her. Never been a shrine prostitute here, the men said. Tamar heard it all in silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. The plan had worked. Her identity was safe, and the pledge, the proof of justice, remained with her. The first month was an agony of uncertainty. Every day was a silent prayer, a search for a sign within her own body. Had her desperate act been for nothing? Had God, in his sovereignty, closed her womb once more, leaving her with only the shame of what she'd done? The irony of her situation was crushing. She, who had been cursed as barren, was now begging for a sign of fertility that would bring her to the brink of death. Faith and fear waged war inside her. Then, in the second month, the answer came. A subtle change, a wave of morning sickness, a life quietly asserting itself within her. The confirmation. Her plan and God's plan had intertwined. There was no burst of joy, but a deep, terrifying tremor of purpose. She laid a hand on her still flat stomach and felt the weight of the future of Judah's lineage. This child wasn't just a son. It was a verdict. It was her defense and her sentence, all at once. By the third month, the secret began to show, a gentle curve to her belly that her widow's robes could no longer completely hide. The looks from the villagers changed. Condescending pity gave way to sharp, cruel suspicion. The women who once treated her like a tragic piece of furniture now spied on her, measured her waist with their eyes, and whispered when say, walk, face. The loneliness she had known deepened into a cold, accusing isolation. The news, like a wildfire in a dry field, finally broke. A village elder, perhaps even her own shamed and furious father, made the disgrace public. Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been unfaithful. She is pregnant as a result of her prostitution. The accusation traveled faster than a horseman, echoing through the valleys until it reached the ears of the man who was the judge of the clan Judah. His family's honor had been stained. Judah's reaction was like thunder. Blinded by his own hypocrisy, he didn't even pause to think. There was no investigation, no mercy, just the rage of a patriarch whose authority had been challenged. From his mouth came the sentence, ruthless and final. Bring her out and have her burned to death. The same man who had casually sinned on the roadside now stood as a pillar of morality, sentencing the woman carrying his own child to death by fire. Judas's order reached Tamar not as a surprise, but as the final piece of her puzzle. Sentenced. The pyre was being built. The fear was real. A cold knot in her stomach. She could almost smell the smoke in her imagination. But beneath the human fear was a supernatural calm. The calm of someone who knows the game isn't over yet. She was not a sheep being led to the slaughter. She was the bait that had finally caught the lion. It's in this moment, at rock bottom, when the sentence seems final and all human hope is gone, that the true nature of faith is revealed. Have you ever been in a place where it felt like all was lost, with only one last, desperate act of trust in God remaining? That was the strength growing in Tamar. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt that your greatest trial was actually the setup for your greatest comeback. With a death sentence hanging over her head, Tamar didn't fall apart. She didn't weep or beg. With a serenity that unnerved everyone, she acted. She took the clay, signet, the braided cord, and the shepherd's staff. Calling a trusted messenger, she handed him the items and whispered an instruction. She wasn't planning an escape. She was preparing her courtroom. The stage for the final act was set, not with a plea for mercy, but with an irrefutable presentation of evidence. The crowd gathered quickly, drawn by the spectacle of justice. They dragged her outside the city gates, a walk of shame she endured with a dignity no one could understand. Fazy showed neither the terror of a criminal nor the defiance of a rebel. It held a somber stillness, the acceptance of one who has handed her case over to a higher court. The whispers followed her, each word a stone. Prostitute disgraced her father. She deserves the fire. And she walked on, feeling the weight of every stare, knowing her silence would be her greatest weapon. In the center of a clearing, the pyre was already built, a grim structure of dry wood, promising an agonizing death. Judah stood there, his face a mask of wounded authority. He was the patriarch, the guardian of the family's honor, and he was about to purify his name with fire. The air was thick with the self-reduced judgment of the crowd and the nearness of death. Everything was ready for the final cleansing act. But as Judah raised his hand to give the final order, a stir in the crowd broke the silence. A man was making his way forward, not with haste, but with the deliberation of someone carrying a veil. Misache. He didn't look at Tamar. His eyes were fixed on Judah. He walked straight to the patriarch, ignoring the murmurs his interruption caused. The tension in the clearing became almost unbearable. The messenger stopped before Judah and, without a word of accusation, held out his hand. In it were the signet ring, the cord, and the staff. Then he delivered the message Tamar had given him, his words ringing out, clear and precise, in the dead silence. The woman you are about to burn sent me to. Say this: I am pregnant by the man who owns these. Take a good look, I beg you. Whose signet and cord and staff are these? The question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to the truth. Judah looked down at the messenger's hand, and his world collapsed. He didn't need a closer look. That was his signet, a clay seal that validated his decrees. That was his cord, which he had worn for years. That was his staff, the extension of his hand and his authority. They were unmistakably his. The weapons of his identity were now the evidence of his crime. A deep, heavy silence fell over the crowd. The buzz of accusations stopped instantly. All eyes swung from the objects to Judah's face. The leader, the judge, the pillar of righteousness, had gone pale. His mask of righteous fury crumbled, revealing a man stripped bare by his own hypocrisy. The entire crowd held its breath, witnessing a trial that had been spectacularly turned on its head. Inside Judah, an avalanche of memory and shame buried him. The image of the veiled woman on the roadside, his casual proposition, his haste, his blindness. The rage he had felt at Tamar's disgrace was really rage at his own unrecognized sin, projected onto her. The woman he'd condemned to the fire was the victim of his own moral failure. The judge was the true defendant. His shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of the revelation. Judah lifted his head. His eyes met Tamar's from across the clearing. There was no triumph in her gaze, just a quiet, settled truth. And from Judah, his broken lips, the voice of God finally found a way out. In a whisper that echoed louder than thunder, he confessed before them all, "She is more righteous than I." The public confession hit the crowd like a shockwave. Disbelief, and then a slow, dawning understanding. The entire story was rewritten in a single instant. The prostitute was the righteous one. The judge was the sinner. The crime was not hers, but his. The hands that might have been ready to throw stones now hung limp and useless. Justice, in a way no one could have expected, had been served. The funeral pyre stood there, a monument to the hypocrisy that had almost consumed an innocent life. The crowd began to drift away in small groups, speaking in hushed, awestruck tones about what they had just witnessed. Judah remained motionless for a long time, holding the symbols of his shame. Tamar was set free, and as she walked back, the crowd parted for her, no longer wheat, contempt, but with a new, fearful respect. She hadn't just saved her life. She had restored the truth, The walk back to her father's house was different. The silence of the crowd parting for her was no longer one of condemnation, but of fearful respect. She entered the house not as a shameful burden, but as a living mystery of divine justice. Her father met her without words, the prior shame on his face replaced by a haunted bewilderment. Tamar didn't need his apologies. Judah's declaration before everyone had been her complete vindication. Judah, for his part, retreated to his own tent, a broken man. The Bible says he knew her no more. And this wasn't just about the physical act. He could never again look at her without seeing the reflection of his own sin and her superior righteousness. That encounter stripped him of his arrogance. He, the patriarch, had been publicly corrected by his daughter-in-law, and that humiliation became the start of a painful wisdom. Be judged, and the experience marked him forever. For Tamar, a new kind of waiting began, not the hopeless, anxious waiting of before, but a waiting filled with purpose. The months of her pregnancy passed in a peace she hadn't known for years. Her communion with God was restored, no longer a cry for justice, but a quiet dialogue with one who had shared a profound secret. She had seen God's hand move in the shadows, using human audacity and weakness to weave his designs. With every day that her belly grew, she felt more deeply the sacredness of what she carried. This was no ordinary pregnancy. It was the continuation of a promise. It was the lineage of Judah, the tribe from which the scepter of Israel would come, which had been nearly extinguished by hypocrisy and fear. Her womb, once deemed cursed and barren, had become the ark that saved the seed of the promise from the flood of human failure. When the labor pains came, she welcomed them. Each contraction was the final pulse of her long battle. In that small room, surrounded by midwives, the climax of her story was no longer a public showdown, but the intimate miracle of life. The pain was real, but it was a redemptive pain. The final seal of her vindication. The sound of life breaking through in a place the world had condemned to silence. And then, a strange and prophetic event marked the birth. The first baby reached out a hand, and the midwife, quick thinking, tied a scarlet thread around his wrist, declaring, "This one came out first." But the baby pulled his hand back, and his brother broke through before him with surprising force. The midwife, astonished, exclaimed, "So you have broken through. This breach be upon you." A fight for the birthright, a preview of destinies, was happening right there at the door of life. They named the firstborn, the one who broke through, Perez, which means breach or breakthrough. They named the second, the one with the scarlet thread, Zerah, which means sunrise or scarlet, names that told a story. Perez, the son of the interruption, the unlikely one, born of his mother's audacity, became the primary heir. The son of apparent shame was now the official future of the mighty tribe of Judah. With the birth of the twins, Tamar's restoration was complete. She was no longer the stigmatized widow. She was Tamar, the matriarch, the mother of Perez and Zerah. Her story became a legend, whispered around campfires, a tale of a woman who used her own shame as a weapon for justice. She became a living example that honor in God's eyes often defies and subverts honor in the eyes of men. She had turned God's silence into a canvas on which he painted his justice with bold, unexpected colors. She taught her tribe and all future generations that God's path is not always the straightest or the easiest to understand. Sometimes he asks us to walk through valleys of ruined reputation to reach the peaks of his eternal purposes. Looking at the faces of her sons, Perez and Zerah, Tamar finally understood. She may not have known that the genealogy of Perez would include names like David, Solomon, and ultimately, Jesus. But she knew what mattered. She knew that her cry in the desert of her pain had not been ignored. God had heard her, and in response, he didn't send an angel or a vision. He sent her the courage to become the answer to her own prayer. In the years that followed, Tamar raised her sons not in the shadow of shame, but in the light of a hard-won truth. She told them the story of their birth, not as a scandal to be hidden, but as a testimony to the power of a God who hears the cry of the wronged and can turn an act of desperation into a gateway for his promises. She became the keeper of a sacred memory, Life in the village returned to its rhythms. Harvests came and went, seasons changed, and the drama of Tamar's trial faded into legend. A story of both warning and hope. She aged with grace, watching her boys become men, leaders of their own families. The palm tree, once bent low under the weight of disgrace, now stood tall and strong, offering shade, wisdom, and the example of an unbreakable faith. Her one act of courage echoed through time, far beyond what she could have ever imagined. Without her intervention, the line of Judah, the royal line, would have taken a different path, perhaps one of weakness, born of Judah's fear of upholding the law. Tamar's act was a divine course correction, a surgical intervention in salvation history, performed not by an angel with a sword, but by a widow with a veil. Her story reveals a profound facet of God's justice. He works not just in our perfection, but in the mess of our imperfect lives. He didn't have to override Tamar's plan, anointed Italiano. He used her cunning, Judah's hypocrisy, and the public disgrace to forge a result more just and pure than anyone involved could have engineered on their own. And the name of Perez, the one who breaks through, became Hanecho. In the halls of time, from Perez was born Hezron, and from Hezron Ram, and the lineage flowed onward, generation after generation, like a mighty river flowing toward an ocean Tamar would never see. Her son, born of a breach in law and society, became the bridge to Israel's greatest king, David, and to the ultimate promise his house contained. The woman who was veiled to hide her identity is today one of only 5 women whose names are unveiled and honored in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Woman sentenced to the fire for an act of prostitution now carries an eternal flame in the story of redemption, a beacon for all who feel forgotten, wronged, and voiceless. God's reversal was total and eternal. Tamar's story is one of the most powerful proofs that God's justice may be silent, but it is never absent. I'm deeply grateful we've walked this journey of pain, faith, and vindication together. If this story resonated in your soul, please leave your final thoughts in the comments. It's a tremendous joy to know what has found a home in your heart. In her final years, Tamar found a peace that surpassed all understanding. Looking at her grandchildren, the children of Perez, she no longer saw a painful past, but the future of a blossoming promise. She didn't have to forget her pain to be healed. She was healed by seeing how God used every broken piece of her life to build something beautiful and everlasting. The final message of her life is a legacy for us all. God doesn't just side with the oppressed. He empowers them to become his agents of change. The strongest faith is often not the one that passively waits for a miracle, but the one that stands up and, with courage and risk, walks toward it, trusting that God will make a way in the middle of the impossible. And so, the palm tree planted in the dry soil of humiliation and injustice not only survived but flourished in a way no one could have predicted. Its fruit, born of pain and audacity, would feed the line of an eternal king, proving forever. But in God's hands, no life is so broken it can't be redeemed, and no shame is so deep it can't be transformed into glory.